The move to Oakhaven had been a career necessity disguised as an ecological adventure. I, Eleanor Caldwell, a woman whose life was meticulously catalogued in peer-reviewed journals and laboratory data, had accepted a research transfer to this forgotten corner of the Pacific Northwest. My specialization was in the mycological structures of old-growth forests, a field that demanded cold, damp isolation. Oakhaven, perpetually mist-shrouded and nestled against the sprawling, intimidating Blackwood, offered isolation in suffocating abundance. I was, by nature, a creature of skeptical empiricism. I believed only in what I could quantify, weigh, and test. Yet, the moment my 4x4 tires crunched onto the gravel path leading to my rented cabin, a sagging structure of cedar and rot, I felt an alien pressure. It was not the crisp, clean chill of the mountains, but a heavy, almost sylvan dread that seemed to cling to the air like the perpetual fog. The silence here wasn't peaceful. It was a profound, waiting stillness, broken only by the drip of moisture from massive, ancient pines whose canopies blocked out the sun even at midday. My rental was situated at the very edge of town, where the asphalt surrendered to the moss and loam of the Blackwood. They called the innermost, oldest stretch of the forest the quiet zone, Vung Lang, a place the locals avoided with superstitious fervor. For me, it was the epicenter of my research, the deepest stratum of unmolested data. I had dismissed the local folklore, tales of things that walked between the roots, of trees that whispered in the wind, as the predictable cultural anxiety of a town that had been left behind by progress. The immediate problem, however, was mundane: furniture. Specifically, my heavy antique mahogany desk and, worse, the industrial-grade optical microscope locked inside a heavy steel travel trunk. I was straining, grappling with the trunk on the cabin's rickety porch steps, sweat prickling my scalp despite the cold air, when I heard the crunch of boots behind me. I spun around, expecting the delivery driver who'd abandoned me hours ago. Instead, I saw a man who seemed carved from the landscape itself. He was tall and powerfully built, but his joints moved with the slow, measured pace of someone who knew the value of patience. His skin was leathered and deeply lined, his beard thick and silver, but his eyes, they were the color of rain on slate, piercing and impossibly deep. He wore dark, rough-spun wool clothing, not the modern Gore-Tex favored by loggers, but something archaic, almost ceremonial, cinched with a wide leather belt. His hands were huge, scarred, and looked like they'd spent a lifetime gripping things that fought back. "Lost your hold, miss?" His voice was a deep baritone, heavy and resonant, carrying an accent I couldn't place. Not quite Scottish, not quite Slavic, but something older, burdened. I managed a strained smile. Just slightly outmatched, I'm afraid. The removal company. Well, they took their pay and their leave. The man didn't return the smile. He simply regarded me, his gaze lingering on my face with an unsettling intensity. "I am Jeremiah Thorne. Around here, they call me the Thorn, or maybe nothing at all." He stepped forward, and I noticed the utter silence of his approach moments before. He moved with a practiced grace that belied his size. "Eleanor Caldwell. Nice to meet you, Mr. Thorne. I'd offer you a beer, but I haven't unpacked the fridge yet." "No need for payment, Miss Caldwell," he said, ignoring the jest. He walked past me, crouched, and effortlessly lifted the heavy steel trunk, cradling it in his arms as if it were a basket of kindling. A gift to a newcomer. The trunk, containing thousands of dollars worth of specialized equipment, weighed nearly 200 pounds. I watched, open-mouthed, as he carried it up the 3 steps and set it down inside the threshold with barely a grunt. When he turned back to me, the atmosphere shifted. The brief moment of physical exertion seemed to have been a prelude. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took a deliberate step closer, crowding me on the narrow porch. "You come here to study the roots and the rot, the living and the dying," he stated, not as a question, but as a pronouncement. "That's right. I'm a field botanist. specifically mycology. He nodded slowly, a gesture of grim confirmation. Then you will seek the deep places, the places where the light never reaches. He fixed those slate-gray eyes directly on mine, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Oakhaven weather. Listen to me, Miss Caldwell. There are boundaries here, boundaries woven of silence and memory. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, yet every word was etched with granite clarity. Do not, even a single step, wander alone into the quiet zone of the Blackwood. Do not seek what is sleeping there. It holds things your science cannot touch, things that demand more than observation. I felt a flash of professional indignation, dismissing his superstition as the local lunacy I had anticipated. Mr. Thorne, my job requires me to go precisely where the unique specimens are. I am equipped, and I am careful. A pained look, of genuine, desperate concern, crossed his features. It was the look of a father watching his child step onto thin ice. He shook his head slowly. You do not understand. You have the curiosity, but not the protection. He set down an invisible burden, sighed deeply, and then, without asking, he raised his hands. His palms were open and facing me, but he did not touch me. His eyes closed and he began to speak. The words were unlike any I had ever heard. It was a guttural, humming sound, laced with hard consonants and soft, flowing vowels, sounding like stones rolling in a riverbed. It was a language of earth and shadow, a chant that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the very wood of the cabin behind me. The prayer was brief, maybe 60 seconds, but it felt vast and utterly sincere. When he finished, he opened his eyes, and the intensity was gone, replaced by a profound weariness. He lowered his hands, gave me a brief, curt nod, and turned towards the path. Stay on the fringes, Miss Caldwell, and burn the red twine if you ever find it. Before I could formulate a single, rational question, what was that language? What on earth is red twine? Jeremiah Thorne was gone. The crunch of his boots disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. I stood alone, surrounded by the dripping silence, the heavy steel trunk a mundane testament to the impossible ease with which a total stranger had moved it. I did not see Jeremiah Thorne again. Not on the main road, not in the solitary grocery store, and certainly not on the wooded fringes of the town. He appeared, warned, blessed, and vanished. It was an oddity, perhaps a coincidence, but it marked the precise moment when the scientific certainty of Eleanor Caldwell began to crumble under the oppressive weight of Oakhaven's reality. The strangeness had begun, and the forest was waiting for my first expedition. The following week, the encounter with Jeremiah Thorne became a strange, quickly suppressed anecdote. Eleanor, fueled by coffee and a rigid schedule, forced herself back into the routine of the rational. She established her laboratory within the cabin, the clinical steel of the microscope and the precise measurements of her vials standing in stark contrast to the rough, mossy wood of her surroundings. Science was a comfort. It was predictable. Yet, Oakhaven resisted predictability. The first expedition into the Blackwood was a sensory overload. The air was thick with the scent of decomposing cedar and rich, fertile earth, a perfumer's blend of life and death. Eleanor was thrilled. This was virgin territory for mycology. But the trees were unlike any she had catalogued before. They were gargantuan, reaching impossible heights, their trunks scarred by time and perhaps by something else. The deepest shadows seemed to move just out of peripheral sight, and the perpetual drip of the canopy sounded sometimes like hurried footsteps in the wet leaves. She worked the fringes first, systematically collecting samples. It was here, 3 days into her research, that the first true rupture in her reality occurred. She found it not far from her boundary markers, near a stagnant stream choked with black algae. It was a great gray owl, Strix nebulosa, one of the largest owls in North America. But this specimen was terrifyingly wrong. It lay on the damp ground, perfectly preserved by the cold, yet completely desiccated, as though it had been subjected to an unnatural, sudden drought. Eleanor, fascinated despite her revulsion, carefully approached the bird, wearing thick gloves. She noted the meticulous feather patterns, the span of its wings. Then she saw the damage. The entire orbital area, where the owl's huge, luminous yellow eyes should have been, was a clean, hollow cavity. They hadn't been decayed or pecked out by scavengers. They had been surgically removed. The surrounding flesh was tight and intact, suggesting a swift, precise operation, but by what kind of predator? More disturbingly, pinned to the owl's breastbone, holding the body flat against the dirt, was a barbed wooden spike. It was smooth, dark, and tapered, driven deep into the fragile skeleton. A bizarre form of display, Eleanor muttered to herself, pulling out her camera and recording notes into her waterproof field recorder. Ritualistic killing, or simply a local hunter with a morbid sense of humor? She catalogued the specimen, determined to transport it back to her lab for a full postmortem. As she carefully lifted the owl, she noticed that something had been placed inside the eye sockets. Not organs, but tiny, glistening, dark red berries. They looked like the fruit of some local nightshade, a toxic offering. The scientific explanation, a rare predator, a local psychopath, was thin, but Eleanor clung to it, refusing to acknowledge the creeping dread that this felt like a deliberate signpost. The next unsettling incident happened a week later, further into the woods, though still outside the ill-defined quiet zone. Eleanor had ventured into a dense patch of spruce, using a topographical map to navigate an area reportedly clear of any human construction for decades. It was here, tucked deep within a thicket of thorns and wet brush, that she found the hut. It was less a cabin and more a large, skeletal frame of rotting logs and stretched animal hides, barely discernible beneath a suffocating layer of moss and ivy. The air around it was different, stale and cloyingly sweet, like honey mixed with old blood. A thin wisp of acrid smoke, smelling faintly of burnt hair and sulfur, curled lazily from a hole in the roof. The door, made of rough-hewn pine, was slightly ajar. Eleanor, driven by a mixture of anthropological curiosity and professional recklessness, hesitated only for a moment before pushing it open, the hinges screaming a protest that echoed morbidly in the silence. Inside, the light was minimal, filtering through the cracks and the smoke hole. The entire space was dominated by one gruesome focal point, a crude, makeshift altar. It was built of stacked river stones and pieces of bleached animal bone, piled nearly 4 feet high. The surface was a chaotic tableau of dark magic. Black, cylindrical candles, melted into grotesque, weeping shapes, stained the stones with wax. There were sheaves of dried herbs tied with what looked like sinew, small bundles of human hair bound together, and, most sickeningly, a scattering of small, pale teeth that Eleanor immediately recognized as belonging to a young deer. But what drew her eye, freezing her blood in her veins, was the centerpiece. Stretched flat across the top of the altar was the freshly gutted carcass of a large badger. It lay there, its internal organs missing, and protruding from its ribcage was a long ceremonial knife of darkened iron. The bone handle of the knife was wrapped in frayed, crimson fabric. The horror was immediate and visceral, shattering her scientific composure. This was not folklore. This was raw, deliberate, living evil. As Eleanor scrambled backwards, tripping over a low log near the entrance, she heard a sound. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the settling of the hut. It was a sudden, sharp, agitated movement from the surrounding thicket. Before she could regain her footing, a figure burst from the trees like a startled deer. He was a man, but barely recognizable as such. He was nearly naked, his gaunt frame covered in mud and a complex, swirling tapestry of black, amateur tattoos that looked like ancient symbols or crude root systems. His hair was a wild, matted mess, and his eyes, wide, yellowed, and utterly deranged, flickered towards Eleanor. He was barefoot, his skin scarred and toughened. He wore only a pair of faded, ragged pants the color of dried blood. He didn't speak. He didn't even yell. He stopped, his body coiled, and he released a sound that was pure biological terror. A high-pitched, spitting hiss, precisely like a cornered cat, only magnified by a throat that seemed to have forgotten how to form human words. Then, with an impossible surge of speed, the man bolted. He didn't follow the path. He crashed through the underbrush, a streak of tattered red and brown, disappearing into the dense, foggy canopy in mere seconds. Eleanor didn't move for a long, paralyzing minute. The blood pounded behind her ears. Her first instinct was to document, but the fear was too intense, too absolute. Her scientific brain was useless here. She turned and ran, ignoring her backpack, her samples, her direction. She ran until the scent of sulfur and rot was replaced by the clean, cold dampness of the main forest. When she finally stumbled onto a logging road, trembling, she pulled out her satellite phone and dialed the Oakhaven Sheriff's Department. The police response was polite but detached. Sheriff Hayes, a man whose voice sounded as weary as the landscape, arrived an hour later. He listened to her frantic, almost hysterical description of the altar, the dead animal, and the wild man in the red trousers. They drove to the location. The hut was found, the gruesome altar intact. Sheriff Hayes's demeanor was strangely neutral. He didn't express shock or disgust, only a resigned familiarity. He took pictures of the structure and the knife, but his focus seemed primarily on the potential fire hazard from the candles. "We get these incidents," Hayes said, his expression flat as he looked at the carvings on the bone-strewn altar. "Kids, hermits, sometimes people with a real bad habit. They practice things they shouldn't." Eleanor pressed him about the wild man. "He hissed at me, Sheriff. He wasn't right. And that knife, that's a murder scene waiting to happen." Hayes sighed, turning away from the altar. "We'll put out an alert. But the Blackwood, it's vast. People disappear in here all the time, Miss Caldwell." He paused, his eyes flickering towards the deep shadows where the man had fled. "It's best if you report the job site closed and stay off this land." When they left, Hayes didn't mention the red twine, the owl, or Jeremiah Thorne. But Eleanor had seen it in his eyes. He knew what she had found was more than just a bad habit. He knew the name of the cult, the meaning of the symbols, and the history of the violence. The police weren't protecting the town. They were performing triage, managing a threat they knew they couldn't eradicate. Eleanor returned to her cabin, no longer seeking data, but desperate for the flimsy comfort of its walls. She felt exposed, tainted by the stench of the hut, and realized with chilling clarity, she was not just studying the forest. She had stumbled into a long, quiet war. Eleanor's scientific mission was officially stalled. The fear she had felt running from the man in the red trousers was not the momentary jolt of adrenaline she was used to. It was a persistent, clammy dread that made her skin crawl even under the warm light of her laboratory lamp. She reported the job site abandoned, citing unforeseen hazards, and retreated fully into the dubious sanctuary of her rented cabin. The cabin felt less like shelter and more like a besieged fortress. Every creak of the old cedar, every rustle of the surrounding brush, was magnified tenfold. She began sleeping poorly, waking often to the terrifying lack of sound, the absolute heavy silence that she knew meant the forest was listening. It was during this period of anxious self-quarantine that the gifts began to arrive. The first was subtle. A beautiful, intact rattlesnake skin, perfectly shed, lay coiled on the welcome mat outside her front door. It wasn't threatening, but it was unsettling. Rattlesnakes were rare this far north, and this one looked freshly molted. Eleanor used a shovel to dispose of it, trying to rationalize it as a random offering from the wild. The next day it escalated. Hanging from the lowest branch of the stunted pine directly beside her porch was a small, gruesome display. It was a thrush, its iridescent feathers still vibrant, but its neck was snapped and its small body was tied to the branch with a piece of rough red twine. The cord was thin, coarse, and vividly crimson, the exact color Jeremiah Thorne had warned her about. "Burn the red twine if you ever find it." His deep voice echoed in her memory, making her stomach clench. She didn't dare touch it. She stood on the porch, examining the scene with her binoculars. The knot was precise, complex, a binding not meant for haste but for ritual. She called the sheriff's department again, her voice shaking with controlled hysteria. Sheriff Hayes sounded even more weary than before. "A dead bird, Miss Caldwell? We can't file a report on a common nuisance. Try to scare off the scavengers." "It's the twine, Sheriff. It's red twine, tied in a ceremonial knot. This is not a common nuisance. This is intimidation." Hayes was silent for a long moment. "Look, I told you Oakhaven has its hermits. They leave offerings. Throw it away. Don't look at it." The detached finality in his voice was chilling. He wasn't denying the ritualistic nature. He was warning her off. Eleanor didn't throw it away. Instead, she took her high-powered camera and zoomed in, capturing every detail of the twine, the knot, and the bird's still body. She then dragged a rusty oil barrel from the back of the cabin, placed the branch and the bird inside, soaked it in lighter fluid and set it ablaze. The red twine crackled and dissolved into black ash, releasing a foul, sickly sweet smoke that made her gag. The following morning, the gifts had multiplied. On her windowsill, there were 3 items arranged in a neat symmetrical triangle. A perfectly bleached rib bone from a small mammal, a clump of thick, dark human hair, not gray, but the rich brown of a young man, and a small, smooth slate stone marked with the same spiral, root-like symbol she had seen tattooed on the wild man in the woods. Eleanor didn't scream, but a cold, heavy wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't random. It was a progression. Someone or something was escalating the terror, proving their proximity and power. She spent the next few days in a state of high-alert paranoia. She locked her doors and windows, taped up the smallest cracks, and began carefully rationing her food supplies, too terrified to drive into town. The cabin, her safe haven, was now a trap. Then came the centerpiece of the campaign. One bleak, fog-choked afternoon, she was pacing the main room, trying to force herself to look through her microscope, when she caught a glimpse of movement on the porch rail out of the corner of her eye. It was small, dark, and still. She approached the front window with agonizing slowness, pulling the curtain back an inch. Hanging tautly between 2 spindles of the railing was the most terrifying object yet. A meticulously crafted effigy. It was a small doll, maybe 7 inches long, fashioned from tightly bundled twigs and held together with more red twine. Its head was molded from gray clay or mud, its surface rough and uneven. But what made her heart seize was the detail. The effigy was adorned with tiny scraps of fabric that looked unsettlingly like the material of her own sleeping shirt, and its head was decorated with a small, braided length of dark brown human hair. It was the same color and texture as the hair she'd found on her windowsill, and she had a horrible, gut-wrenching certainty that it was her own. This was not a symbol. This was a curse, a malicious representation of herself, hung right outside her door. A shadow doll. Eleanor let out a sharp, choked cry and stumbled backwards, knocking over a chair. Her terror was so loud that it startled the nearest living thing. Agnes. Agnes lived in the only other cabin visible from Eleanor's porch, 100 yards down the slope. Agnes was an old woman, gaunt and perpetually shrouded in heavy, dark clothing, who kept her distance and spoke to no one. Agnes was just getting into her ancient pickup truck when she heard the crash from Eleanor's cabin. She looked up, her face utterly expressionless, her eyes meeting Eleanor's through the glass. Eleanor rushed onto the porch, pointing a trembling finger at the hanging effigy. "Agnes, look, what is that? Who did this?" she screamed, her voice cracking. Agnes paused, her hand hovering over the truck door handle. She looked at the effigy, then back at Eleanor, her slate-like eyes conveying nothing but ancient, weary knowledge. She spoke 3 words, her voice a low, gravelly whisper that nonetheless cut through the fog. "You do not touch." Then, Agnes got into her truck, started the engine, and drove away without another glance, leaving Eleanor alone with the terror hanging inches from her face. The silence that followed Agnes's departure was thick with menace. Eleanor knew she couldn't call the police again. She had to deal with this herself, but the memory of Jeremiah's warning, "Burn the red twine," kept her hand from reaching out. She retreated inside, sinking to the floor, her back pressed against the door, the flimsy wood feeling no stronger than paper. The effigy swung gently in the cold, wet wind, a small, dangling representation of her own impending doom. As night fell, the fear of the effigy turned into a haunting awareness of the things that now surrounded her cabin. She heard the scratching, faint but unmistakable, at the wooden foundation. She saw the shadows shift outside her windows, too low to be deer, too quick to be common coyotes. Once, while staring into the darkness, she swore she saw 6 pale lights, like cold, fungal glows, arranged in a perfect arc at the tree line, watching her. She was losing the battle for her sanity. The empirical certainty that had defined her life was crumbling under the weight of Oakhaven's dark magic. She thought of the 9mm pistol her father had insisted she take, a heavy, reliable Smith & Wesson 5906, that now lay hidden under a pile of clothes. She had mocked the idea then. She didn't mock it now. The next day, she unpacked the pistol, loaded the magazine with trembling hands, and placed it on her bedside table. She had gone from studying the fungi of the earth to preparing for a siege by the spirits of the deep wood. She knew her only chance was to complete her objective, somehow to find the data she came for, and then flee this haunted place forever. She had to venture back into the deep woods, and she knew exactly where she had to go, the center of the quiet zone. The morning Eleanor set out for the quiet zone was a caricature of an Oakhaven day. The air was thick, gray, and silent, the fog pressing down the sounds of the forest until they were muffled and distorted. She felt a grim, almost fatalistic clarity. The siege at the cabin was over. The confrontation had to move to the enemy's ground. She wore her heavy-duty field gear, and the weight of the Smith & Wesson 5906 against her hip, concealed beneath her weatherproof jacket, was a strange, cold comfort. She was no hunter, but the sheer physical reality of the weapon was a bulwark against the supernatural dread. Her objective was precise. A deep geological anomaly marked on her old survey maps, an area that logically should host the most ancient and undisturbed mycological structures. This anomaly lay at the very center of the quiet zone. Crossing the unofficial boundary was like stepping through a film of cold water. The atmosphere immediately intensified. The air grew heavier, colder, and the silence was no longer empty. It felt occupied. The massive, rotting pines here were covered in a species of black, filamentous moss that hung like shrouds. The light level was negligible, forcing her to rely on her headlamp, which cast an inadequate, yellow circle into the endless gloom. She hiked for 2 hours, guided by her compass and the geological readings. The forest floor was treacherous, a complex tangle of roots and decayed matter. She kept one hand on the butt of the pistol, her thumb resting on the safety. It began subtly, as all the horrors here did, the persistent feeling of being watched. It wasn't the paranoia of the cabin. This was active, immediate, and everywhere. She heard faint, shuffling movements, too heavy to be small animals, too light to be a man, tracing her progress through the dense underbrush. "If you're going to follow me, show yourselves," she thought. the sheer exhaustion lending her a desperate bravery. She pressed on until the topographical coordinates matched the reading on her handheld GPS. The anomaly was located in a small, damp hollow, naturally shielded by a tight ring of colossal, ancient firs. Felt like a cathedral of rot. Stepping into the hollow, Eleanor's breath hitched. She hadn't found the expected rock formations for her research. She had found the heart of the curse. In the center of the hollow was a structure, not built by man, but arranged with chilling intent. It was a circle of stones, rough-hewn basalt rocks placed end to end, forming a perfect 10-foot diameter ring. The stones looked as though they had been there since the dawn of the Blackwood, their surfaces smoothed by millennia of rain and shadow. Inside the circle, the ground was a disturbing mosaic of black mud and strange, brittle white fragments that looked suspiciously like bone shards. This was the place, the ritual site of the Sylvan cult. Eleanor cautiously approached the edge of the circle. The air here vibrated with a palpable, unsettling energy. Felt wrong, like standing too close to high-voltage wires. Then, she saw the true nature of the seal. Lining the inner circumference of the stone circle, set into the soft earth between the rocks, were dozens of small, half-buried glass jars. They were antique, corked bottles, and each one contained a fine, pale greenish-blue powder. As the beam of her headlamp swept over them, the powder responded. It wasn't just reflecting light, it was glowing. Bioluminescence. Her scientific brain, starved of data, kicked in despite the terror. This was a species of highly potent, toxic mushroom spore, likely the green varnish veil, Cortinarius viridescens, known for its powerful neurotoxic properties and its strange, ghostly glow. She realized the jars weren't offerings. They were a biochemical seal, a delicate barrier holding something back. She stepped closer, pulling out her camera to document the structure before touching anything. She raised the lens, her eye fixed on the bizarre, glowing circle, and that's when it happened. The ground was slick with wet moss and decay. Her boot slipped on a submerged root. She lost her balance, a desperate, clumsy lurch forward as she tried to catch herself. The steel trunk holding her geological survey tools, the one Jeremiah Thorne had lifted so effortlessly, was still strapped to her back. As she fell, the corner of the heavy trunk slammed into the stone ring. The vibration was sharp and violent. A dozen of the fragile glass jars, packed tightly against the basalt, shattered instantly. The pale green-blue powder, the powerful neurotoxic spores, erupted into the air in a silent, luminous cloud. The corks popped free from the remaining intact jars, and the glowing dust began to settle, coating the moss and the stones in a fine, phosphorescent sheen. As the silence returned, Eleanor scrambled away from the circle, clutching her throat, paralyzed less by the fear of the toxin and more by the terror of what she had just done. She had broken the seal. And then the sound came. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a roar. It was a sudden, chillingly human noise that began as a faint, distant ripple and surged into a terrifying crescendo. It was laughter. It was not the laughter of joy or humor. It was ghastly, multitonal, and utterly devoid of mirth. A sound that scraped against the edges of sanity. It sounded like dozens of voices laughing at once, deep, guttural chuckles mixing with high, brittle cackles, all perfectly synchronized, rising from the deepest core of the Blackwood. The laughter was physical. It pressed against her eardrums, made her teeth ache, and vibrated in the fragile bones of her chest. It was everywhere and nowhere, surrounding the hollow, drowning out the dripping of the rain. It was the sound of utter, overwhelming relief and malevolence. Eleanor dove behind the thickest fur she could find, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind screaming, "Run!" But she couldn't. The laughter had locked her in place. She crouched low, breathing in the cold, damp air, trying to distinguish a direction. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it began. And then a single new sound emerged. It was a soft, dry rasping, like paper against sand. A single voice speaking, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 breaths. It was a whisper that filled the hollow, seeming to originate not from a mouth, but from the air itself. The voice was neither male nor female. It was simply ancient and hungry. She opened it. "Thank you." The words echoed once, twice, fading into the unnatural quiet. Eleanor sprang up, the whisper finally breaking the paralysis of the laughter. She didn't look back at the broken circle. She didn't look for the spores. She simply turned and ran, plunging back into the dense, dark thicket, running blindly, instinctively towards the vague direction of the town. She didn't run with adrenaline. She ran with pure, instinctual fear, the laughter and the horrifying whisper searing themselves onto her soul. She ran until her lungs were burning and her legs were collapsing, finally stumbling out of the trees and onto the familiar, mossy edge of Oakhaven, where the shadows were merely shadows and the quiet was just silence. But the silence was a lie. She had broken the boundary, and she knew the things from the quiet zone would not stay contained any longer. Eleanor's panicked flight from the hollow became a blur of burning lungs and frantic instinct. The whisper, she opened it. "Thank you," was a rhythmic pounding in her skull, drowning out the physical strain. She ran not as a scientist fleeing danger, but as prey escaping a predator whose presence was now everywhere. She dropped her heavy backpack, the gear that had symbolized her rational mission, and kept only the pistol strapped to her waist. She ran for perhaps 15 minutes before she glimpsed the hazy, lighter gray of the edge of the Blackwood. The sight gave her a desperate surge of energy. She clawed her way through the final curtain of tangled vines and low-hanging moss, bursting out onto the narrow, overgrown logging road that bordered the town limits. She stopped dead, leaning against the damp, rough bark of an old hemlock, gasping for air. The transition was immediate. The chilling, heavy silence of the quiet zone was replaced by the familiar, if muffled, sounds of Oakhaven, the distant thrum of a generator, the faint crow of a rooster. But the forest was not done with her. She lifted her head, wiping the sweat and grime from her eyes, and looked at the treeline, where the shadows pooled thickest. There they were, 6 figures. They stood in a line, perfectly spaced, roughly 20 feet inside the thicket, where the sunlight barely penetrated. They were tall, easily 7 feet, and utterly still. They were not made of flesh and bone. They were sculpted entirely from a profound, absorbing darkness, like holes punched in reality. They possessed a vaguely humanoid outline, but lacked all detail. They had no clothes, no features, and most terrifyingly, no faces. They were the entities that had spoken the words. They were the laughter and the whisper made manifest. They did not move. They did not gesture. They simply were, standing on the threshold Eleanor had just crossed, their collective, featureless gazes fixed entirely on her. She felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, a cold, crushing certainty that they knew everything about her, her life, and the breach she had caused. For a long, agonizing moment, Eleanor could only stare back, her mind snapping completely free of logic. The pistol was heavy, cold, and utterly useless against beings made of shadow. She realized they weren't waiting for her. They were marking the boundary. The moment she was entirely on the road, out of the Blackwood's gravitational pull, the intense focus eased, though their presence remained. With a choked cry, Eleanor stumbled onto the logging road and forced her legs to move. She didn't run this time. She walked with a rapid, stumbling pace, constantly glancing over her shoulder until the treeline curved out of sight. She arrived at the Oakhaven Sheriff's Department 10 minutes later, soaking wet, mud-caked, and looking precisely like the raving lunatic she feared she was. The station was small, smelling of stale coffee and damp paperwork. Sheriff Hayes was behind his chipped wooden desk, looking through a stack of invoices. He looked up, his weary expression turning to one of slow, professional alarm. "Miss Caldwell, what in God's name happened to you?" Eleanor slammed her hands on the desk, the movement causing a small tremor that rattled the coffee cup. She was beyond fear. She was operating on a furious need for answers. "The woods, Sheriff. The center. I was at the stone circle. The one you know about, the one with the altar nearby. I fell and I broke the seal, the glass jars. The spores. I heard the laughter, it was everywhere, and then I saw them. 6 of them, standing at the edge of the woods. Black, featureless, tall." She paused, dragging a ragged breath into her lungs. "They told me, Sheriff. They spoke a word of thanks. And I want to know who sealed them up there. I want to know about the man who brought my trunk, the one who tried to protect me. Jeremiah Thorne." Sheriff Hayes leaned back in his squeaky chair, his eyes fixed on her, no longer displaying fatigue, but a deep, profound sadness. He slowly folded his hands on the desk. "Jeremiah Thorne," he repeated, the name heavy on his tongue. "You said he was an old man, right? Heavy-set, quiet voice. Wore an old, dark coat." "Yes. He helped me move in, warned me about the quiet zone, and gave me a blessing, a prayer." Eleanor practically begged him to confirm her reality. Hayes reached into the file cabinet behind him and pulled out a thick, yellowed folder marked with a single archaic insignia, the same root-like spiral she had seen tattooed on the wild man. He flipped it open and slid a grainy, black-and-white photograph across the desk. It was Jeremiah Thorne. Younger, yes, but undeniably the same man. Hayes's voice dropped to a low, official monotone, the one used to deliver old, irrevocable truths. Jeremiah Thorne was the high keeper of the old path, what the local papers called the Sylvan cult. They worshipped the life and death cycle of the Blackwood, but their practices, they descended into things far darker than ancestor worship. They needed certain sacrifices, certain vessels, to feed the things that live in the deepest parts of the quiet zone. He tapped the photo with a blunt finger. Jeremiah was a powerful one, the boundary keeper. But 10 years ago, the cult began to turn against itself. They realized they were feeding something too hungry, something they couldn't control. Jeremiah tried to seal it back. Hayes's eyes met hers, cold and unwavering. "Miss Caldwell, the circle you found? The jars of green varnish veil? That wasn't an offering. It was a witch's seal. A highly unstable, poisonous boundary that Jeremiah spent years gathering resources to build. He used his own life force to power the final enchantment." Eleanor felt the room tilt. He was there. When I arrived. He was real. "He was real," Hayes confirmed. "But he wasn't there. At least not physically. Jeremiah Thorne committed suicide 10 years ago. He self-immolated. He poured pitch and lamp oil over himself and set himself on fire right in the center of that stone circle as the final part of the binding spell. The bones you saw in the mud? That was him. The ashes and the burnt earth, that's what powered the toxic spores. He was the barrier." Eleanor backed away from the desk, her breath trapped in her chest. The memory of the gentle hand on her shoulder, the soft prayer in the ancient dialect, was suddenly transformed into the final, desperate act of a dying man's ghost, transferring his protective ward. So, the blessing, the prayer. It was his final attempt to fortify the seal's energy, Hayes finished grimly. "He was warning you off, Miss Caldwell. You crossed the boundary, and his spirit saw you as the first living thing to enter its sphere in a decade. He put his old charm on you, the Corey bond, a shield used by his people. But when you fell, when you smashed those jars, you didn't just break glass." Hayes paused, looking past Eleanor to the window, as if seeing the shadows himself. "You shattered the will of a dead man. You broke the shield, and you released the enemy he died to contain." Eleanor stared at the photograph of the ghost who had saved her life and realized the full, terrifying weight of the thank you. The entities had been waiting, trapped by the sacrifice of the boundary keeper, and she, the rational, scientific woman, had been the unwitting key to their freedom. The silence inside the sheriff's office was far more oppressive than the laughter of the shadows. Eleanor stood rooted, gazing at the faded photograph of the man who had lifted her sofa and blessed her. The man whose charred remains lay buried beneath the toxic seal she had just shattered. Jeremiah Thorne, the boundary keeper, dead for 10 years, yet his final, desperate will had manifested as a protective ward, a thin layer of grace she had accepted as mere southern hospitality. "He was trying to protect you, Miss Caldwell," Sheriff Hayes said, closing the folder with a sharp thwack that made Eleanor jump. His spirit, his lingering focus. When you told him your job was in the woods, he had to act. The prayer was the Corée bond, a shield against the Sylvan's influence. You lived through the wild man and the effigy because you wore the dead man's will. Eleanor sank into a chair, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "And when I broke the seal, you broke the enchantment," Hayes finished, his face etched with genuine fear now. "The bond weakened immediately. His work, his sacrifice is undone. The things he held back, the things they feed, they are now free to hunt and spread. And they know who to thank." Hayes stood up, pulling a shotgun from the rack and chambering a round with a chilling metallic sound. "I'll be honest with you. This town is old and sick. We've kept the peace because we've respected the boundaries, even the boundaries of the dead. Now that the boundary is gone, I can't guarantee your safety for another night. My job, my equipment is still out there." Hayes laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "Keep your total station. Keep your field journal. Get whatever you left in the woods, and call it a loss. The company knows better than to press. Now, you need to call your office, report a massive, fabricated ecological disaster, say a methane leak, say an active fault line, and get yourself transferred to the driest, most populated patch of desert you can find." Eluding the sheriff's advice, Eleanor left the station, the fear replaced by a cold, surgical focus on survival. She drove the 3 blocks back to the apartment complex, the world outside her windshield looking like a cheap, fragile veneer that could tear away at any moment to reveal the shadows lurking behind. She spent the next hour working with a frightening efficiency, contacting her regional manager and delivering a masterful performance of a terrified employee witnessing an environmental catastrophe at the Quiet Zone property. She cited specific, impossible data points: a sudden, unmappable magnetic anomaly, evidence of heavy metal contamination. Anything to make the land unusable and her presence unnecessary. The manager, already jittery after the first police report about the altar, agreed instantly to expedite her emergency transfer. She was authorized to abandon all non-essential equipment and given a temporary assignment in Phoenix, Arizona. Phoenix, dry, populated, sunlight. The name was a prayer. She began throwing her life into boxes. Her books, her clothes, her gaming rig. She worked furiously, avoiding the balcony door, avoiding the windows, convinced that the 6 tall shadows were already assembling outside. The only thing she hesitated over was the voodoo effigy. It lay exactly where she had left it, wedged between the 2 balcony rails, a twisted, human-shaped bundle of hair, twigs and dried, bloody moss, tied with the ominous red cord. It was her focus, the most tangible symbol of the hatred aimed at her. Sheriff Hayes had called it a Corée bond, a shield. But what if it was now a magnet? Before she could debate the wisdom of touching it, a soft cough broke the dead silence of her focus. She spun around. Agnes, her neighbor, stood silently on the landing below, holding a small brown grocery bag. She wasn't looking at Eleanor, but at the effigy. "I heard you talking on the phone," Agnes said, her voice thin and raspy, devoid of inflection. "You're leaving Oakhaven." "Yes, now." Eleanor watched the woman carefully. Agnes had never offered more than a curt nod, but now she seemed contemplative, her gaze fixed on the balcony relic. "He died to keep the boundary," Agnes said, startling Eleanor with the reference. Jeremiah. He was a good man for a witch. You knew him? Agnes finally looked up, her old eyes holding a vast, ancient pity. We all knew him. He kept the Blackwood quiet. You broke the spell, Eleanor. You opened it. Eleanor swallowed hard. I know. I need to know what to do with that. She pointed a trembling finger at the effigy. Is it safe to burn it? Agnes sighed, a sound of profound disappointment. You don't understand the exchange. The curse that placed that doll there. It was meant to draw the shadows, to break Jeremiah's weak hold on you. But the prayer, the Corey bond, turned it. It became a relic of the sacrifice. She stepped closer to the railing, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. When the keeper dies, his magic lives on in a vessel. That doll, made with your hair, tied with their blood thread, it wasn't just a curse. It became the repository of his final will. It holds the last shard of Jeremiah's protection. Agnes reached into her grocery bag and pulled out a small, dried, brown sachet wrapped in a piece of faded gingham. You didn't know how to guard the gift, but you will need it now. Burn the doll and you burn the last of your luck. Take it with you. Agnes tossed the small sachet over the railing. It landed at Eleanor's feet. What is this? Eleanor asked, looking down at the strange package. Protection for the road. Made from the roots of the Watcher's tree. It won't stop them, but it will slow them down. And take the doll. Agnes gave Eleanor a grim, final look. It is the only part of Oakhaven that still remembers Jeremiah Thorne's promise. You carry his failure, but you also carry his final gift. Without another word, Agnes turned, walked down the stairs, and disappeared into the gray afternoon. Eleanor stared at the doll, then at the sachet. She had two choices. The scientific choice, burn the toxic relic and try to forget, or the terrible, terrifying choice of the mad, the superstitious, and the soon-to-be hunted. She chose the latter. Carefully, using tongs, she placed the voodoo effigy, the relic of a dead man's promise, into a plastic zip-top bag. She tucked Agnes's sachet into the innermost pocket of her jacket, next to the 9mm pistol. The drive was the longest, most chilling ordeal of her life. She kept the windows rolled up and the radio on, blasting static and country music, trying to drown out the silence. She felt them immediately, not seeing but feeling the pressure. As she drove the final, winding mile to the state highway, she chanced a look in her rearview mirror. The road was empty, but then she looked at the woods bordering the road. There were no defined shapes, no clear figures, only the sense of movement, a continuous, rippling blackness flowing through the trees, keeping perfect pace with the car. She saw flashes of impossible height, brief, blurring glimpses of the six shadows moving with a silent, fluid speed that defied physics. They weren't pursuing her. They were escorting her. And then, she heard it faintly over the radio static. The horrible, collective, ecstatic laughter. It was distant, but it was following. It faded only when she crossed the parish line, the official boundary of Oakhaven, onto the wide, bustling highway. When she looked in the rearview mirror one last time, the Blackwood was gone, replaced by sprawling farmland and clear sky. But the laughter didn't quite disappear. It had burrowed deep into the quiet, shadowed corners of her mind. Eleanor never returned to Oakhaven. She became an efficient, driven botanist in the arid lands of Arizona, a woman who always requested ground-floor offices and kept her curtains drawn tight. She never stepped into a forest again. Her life was forever defined by the things she carried. The 9mm pistol she never returned, the dried root sachet she never opened, and the small, dark voodoo effigy, the relic of Oakhaven, which she kept locked in a steel safe, the physical proof of the night a dead man saved her life, and a living woman thanked his enemies. She knew they were still waiting, listening for the day she finally let go of the last, fragile piece of the boundary keeper's will. And every time she closed her eyes, she heard the whisper, clear and cold, ringing out from the empty hollow of the woods she could never forget. "You got to stay out of these woods around here, child,"